Hello, and welcome to today's PR Roundtable. I appreciate you joining us with all that's happening in the world right now. Our only hope is that we can kind of get your eyes off the news for at least an hour and to talk about storytelling. That's the topic that we have today. So, as communication professionals, we're all in the business of telling stories. But as we all know, having news to share and turning that news into a story that resonates with your audience are two different things. So, what can we do to make our news irresistible? And how can we spot opportunities for authentic storytelling around your brand? To take us through the subject today is master storyteller Melanie Deziel. And do I pronounce that correctly, Melanie? How do
I
you
like
pronounce
you spiced it up a little bit. I just say diesel. That's the
Diesel?
Americanized version, but I like when there's a little spice.
But is it like a French origin? Yeah, right?
It
Is
is
it?
French origin, yeah,
Yeah,
and just
yeah. So
over the
it's
generations, all the French intonation is gone.
yeah. Like we would like because Belgium is partly French. We would say Diziel or something. That's kind of like the
Exactly.
French pronoun. So okay, or
Yeah.
but diesel. That's of course diesel. I'll use diesel. That's easier. Easier. Okay. So yeah, Melanie was a journalist before. She has experience in that. She was editor of the New York Times, the branded content at New York Times. She helped establish HuffPost Partner Studios. She developed content strategy for Gary Vaynerchuk's Brave Venture and literally wrote the book on brand storytelling. I think Kate can link that, and we're going to get later into that. And currently, she is founder and VP of marketing at theconvoy.com for the Groupon, she told me, for B2B businesses. She can go into that. So, how are you today, Melanie? Everything all right?
I'm good, hanging in there like the rest of us. Speaking of PR, it's a strange time to be called the convoy when you have nothing to do with truckers and their protests. But
Yeah, that's true.
we're we're making our way.
Yeah, but that's good. All right. So, everything when I started kind of looking into the material and your social, everything
Yeah.
is around storytelling, and everything that you do seems to be focused on that. Like how did you start it with that? Like why is storytelling at the heart of everything that you do?
I think if I go all the way back, I know that I always realized as a kid that like storytelling was a way to get people's attention.
Hmm.
And so I know like when I was little and you're a kid and no one's listening to you, the adults are doing their own thing. And I realized that if I could say, you'll never believe when I start telling a dramatic story, that's how I could get attention as a kid. And so that kind of fed into me seeing journalism as a way to tell different stories every day, to interview new experts and kind of jump around to different topics. So I think it was sort of that combination that got me really inspired about the power of telling stories. And then just kind of realized that there was a real need for those kinds of skills in the marketing side of things. And so that's kind of how I made my way over to the other side, if you will, and started working on sharing those same best practices in a marketing context.
Okay, cool. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess like coming from a journalist, like you're trained on thinking about what is a good angle, what is interesting, but and what do you learn about what the essence is of a good story? How do you approach such a thing? Like when do you feel all right? This is an angle where we can work with. Like, do you have like a methodology? Probably you have. You've written a book about this, but can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different things that we look for, from a journalist side of things. I mean, the first one is newsworthiness. So, like, why
Mm-hmm.
do people care? Is this relevant right now? That's kind of a question we're always asking. Like, what do people care
Mm-hmm.
about right now? Looking into what's trending or what's the topic of conversation. Another one is human interest. And so, thinking about how does this affect people and whether that's the people in your audience or the people of the story. Just when we include people in our content, it makes it so much more relatable. Try to think of a single show or movie or book that didn't have characters in it. It's
Yeah.
the people that we can, or maybe animals or mythical creatures, but the people is what we connect to. And so trying to bring in as many human faces and voices as we can into the stories we tell. And then the other thing to think about is what's unique about it. Now, this is where can be particularly challenging sometimes from a PR
Mm-hmm.
perspective. But journalists are always looking to find out, well, what's different about this story? Why is this something worth talking about versus maybe other approaches or other conversations on the same topic? So, those three things: the newsworthiness, the human element, and then what's unique about this story is going to be sort of the first things we want to look for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And this seems to be of all times, right? These are kind of rules that were like still very relevant, but were relevant probably like 40 years ago. But there
Oh
are
yeah.
probably other things that kind of changed, like especially I think the last 15 years, and we definitely see that in PR and communication. But
Yeah.
how do you kind of see like notice that storytelling changed over the years with social influencers, like other media formats like podcasts, something like this, like live streams? Like
Yeah.
how has that been impacting storytelling?
There's a couple things that have definitely shifted. I mean, first, of course, is the technology we use to tell our stories. So some of the stories, that the message may be the same, but the medium that we're delivering it in may be very different. So you're hearing people talk about now, what are we doing in the metaverse, right? Are we doing NFTs? Like obviously, we weren't having those conversations even 3 years ago for the most part. But we had a similar experience, with infographics, with video further back, with audio, when podcasts really took off, and sort of the early, like 2014, I think, was right around when podcasts were started being all the rage. So we are constantly being given new tools to tell our stories, which actually makes it really exciting, I think. And the other thing is, I think we've sort of realized that storytelling is important more so than we had maybe 10, 15 years ago. I remember I guess this was like the early 2010s, working with brands and having to kind of convince them, like, we should
Yes.
tell stories, we should make content. The thought process was very much, we're going to create ads. That's going to be TV ads. Maybe we'll do some digital ads. I don't know about that. I'm not so sure. But the idea of like creating a video that wasn't a TV commercial, or creating content that wasn't a script for a commercial or something, it was kind of a hard sell. We really had to convince people for a while. And I think now, especially just the way even media has exploded, that we have so many streaming platforms and YouTube and all these other platforms available to us, I think luckily we don't have to convince brands and folks to tell stories anymore. Now that's sort of a given. We all know that that's something worth doing.
Yeah, I'm always curious that like if something like that comes up. Oftentimes we talk about this from a marketing perspective, and I'm oftentimes thinking like, why aren't we looking at this more from a PR perspective, right? Because
Yeah.
I've mentioned this before, but I used to start my career in an advertising agency, and we were sometimes really struggling with building stories because we were kind of used to kind of doing this and that, but an activation and making it flashy and making sure that people see it, like these type, making it funny. But then really when it came to the core about like, all right, what does this company stands for, what's its mission, and especially if people started asking us difficult questions about that, we were like, oh, who should we call, right? So how do you see the opportunities in because I truly believe in the fact that storytelling has become more important and brands are much more aware of it, but what are the opportunities for PR people in that?
I think there's a lot of invitations that we could make internally at the, our clients or the organizations we represent, to find the people who have those stories. And that may sound really simple, but just by joining different, team meetings, or having conversations with people you might not normally talk to, with engineers or designers or, store managers, whatever the case may be, in those conversations, I think we find the stories. And I like to give a tangible example. So, if you're representing, some sort of travel organization or hospitality, that we want to present ourselves as luxury and an escape and all these things. But it's not until you talk to the concierge at this location that knows the city better than anyone, because they've been working there for 25 years and they know, the restaurants that aren't on those top lists. They know the hidden gems, that you're going to realize, like, wow, we have something we can share, that this is knowledge coming from within our organization. These are compelling stories that we can share. Those kind of things really only come from being deeply connected to your organization or your clients, and having conversations where that kind of thing can come up. So even though it sounds really old school, it's not necessarily a measurable thing. Having those conversations, I think, is one of the best ways to uncover those stories.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because what you're telling me is that basically the stories mainly already exist, right? If you need to fabricate them, you're going in the wrong direction, because,
Yeah.
and that's kind of what advertising, at least when I was in there, maybe that's not wanted to talk bad about my advertising career before, but that was something that we were kind of trying to fabricate, right? You try to
Yeah.
fabricate a world that's really not really real or
Yeah.
realistic even, but that's ideal. And is this kind of what the difference is that we try to find stories that already exist and put them on a little bit of a pedestal? Is that kind of a
That's
good analysis?
I think so, yeah, and
Mm.
granted, it may be totally biased because that's my background as a journalist, right?
Yeah, sure.
The approach we have is that like the world is happening all around us. Like there is
Mm.
so much going on, and it's our job to go out there and find those stories, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily to come up with them, to make them up,
Mm-hmm.
or to decide. I always give the example. It's not like you wake up and say, I'm going to write a story about a scandal today. Like the
Yeah,
scandal happens and then you write about it.
yeah.
You can't really decide ahead of time. And that's something that's tough from a PR or a marketing or a planning perspective. But understanding that these stories are there. There are people on your team or in your organization who are doing extraordinary things. There are
Mm-hmm.
people on your team who have a background that's incredible that you can talk about. There are customers or clients that you've helped who have experienced transformation as a result. You just have to go out there and find those stories.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's also that we often take that these things happen a little bit for granted and often don't realize how nice of a story they could become. Is that
Yeah.
is that also like part of the roles that you're open to seeing things that maybe seem mundane from the outside, but if you start digging in and start thinking, is that really what the art of storytelling is about? Is to kind of bring those little gems and kind of polish them and make sure like that they're nice?
Yeah, I love that because I always say we're mining for stories. We know they're hidden
Hmm.
there somewhere, but we've just got to find them. And that perfect analogy there. I think when you think about things that are maybe not exciting to you, but could be exciting to your audience, I always like to come back to, perhaps like someone who's making pizza or a baker or something like that. To them, the ability to like throw pizza dough or like twist a pretzel, like that's
Yeah.
not exciting. They do that 100 times a day. But as someone who can't do that, we stand in the window and
Yeah.
get mesmerized watching them do these things because we don't know how.
Yeah,
And
and
so the same
put it on TikTok, and it gets a million views, right?
there you go, right? And I think if we look at other parts of our lives, we can see that inherently.
Hmm.
We get curious about when you meet someone and they have a job that's so far removed from you. You're like, oh wow, that's interesting. Like, what is that like? And
Yeah.
they may not think it's exciting, but I've got no clue. I think that's really interesting. And there's a show, How It's Made. Have you seen this show?
Yes, yes,
So How
yes.
It's Made is, I mean, like exactly what we're talking about here. It's
Hmm.
just a show that is step by step in a factory, like how tennis balls get made,
Yes.
how, coffee beans are grown, like just totally random things. And the show's been going for like
Yes.
25 seasons, like there's
It's
no
it's like the
shortage.
perfect thing on a Sunday afternoon. It's a
Yeah.
marathon how it's made. That's perfect.
Exactly. I mean, and
Yeah,
so if that show can go on with that whole
yeah.
as their premise, just showing how different industries do different things and make different things. I mean, there's got to be opportunities for you to teach your audience something similar.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I can imagine. And there's kind of Anthony Taylor who says something interesting in the show notes as well in the chat here. I love thinking about content creation in terms of discovery rather than invention. We talk about that a lot in improv, which I think is a really nice
Yeah.
segue into that as well, and how it relates to greater ideas. So thank you for that, Anthony, bringing that up. Really interesting. So. Tell me a little bit about the framework and the book that you've written about this. I think today it's a 2-year anniversary, right? Is that correct? Or I think this is what
Oh my
came
goodness,
kind.
it is. You
Yes.
realized it before I did. It is. It's the 24th. I've like lost all track of dates these
Yes,
days. I'm
but
sure I'm not alone.
it's actually Kate that kind of is like she passes me this note, so all credit goes to her. But congrats on that. So,
Yeah,
but tell us
thank
a
you.
little, yeah, tell us a
That's
little bit more
exciting.
about what our the audience can actually kind of take
Yeah.
away for it. We there's a lot of agencies, PR agencies joining, people that are doing communication for
Yeah.
their own brands. Like, what are the main takeaways you would say for them out of the book?
100%. So the book, which is 2 years old today, I guess, is really all about a system for coming up with content ideas. So
Mm-hmm.
kind of to what Anthony was saying in the comments too, and what we're talking about here, really learning how to view content ideas as sort of a renewable resource. That it's not this scarce thing that's really difficult to find and come up with. That they are everywhere, and it's your job just to look in the right places. And so the content fuel framework is sort of like a checklist. It's sort of a guide of different approaches you can take. So ways that you can give your mind a prompt to say, could I tell the story like this, like this, like this, like this? And it gives you a framework for how to approach your content brainstorms. And the good news is it's also something that's very flexible. So it's not prescriptive to say you must do it this way. It's sort of here's the way of thinking about it, and here are some ways you might apply that to your own processes, your brainstorms, your content calendar, things like that.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. I think Kate can put the link up in the chat, so everyone who's interested definitely check
Yeah.
it out. It's on my Kindle, so I'm definitely going. So I think it's interesting because like as a software business, we're often like thinking like, oh, it's so hard to find interesting stories because like it's very easy. But then all of a sudden you see a customer doing something really awesome, and that's when you need to be like, oh my God, this is awesome. Let's do something with it. And I think
Yeah.
this is something that we needed to learn as well, right? Like instead of trying to grab stories from the air, you just start looking inwards or look at your team or see what a customer had with your tool and kind of build it from there. So that's been from our part like an interesting discovery as well. I think the
I think
hard part about that is okay, this is interesting for me now because I'm so deep into this. But how can I test it's actually interesting for a bigger audience? Do you have some pointers on that?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to do this. I mean, the easiest way is to just do it directly, float it by a couple people in your
Mm-hmm.
audience. I'm a big fan of dropping things in smaller pieces and building up.
Okay.
So maybe you
Mm-hmm.
share a tweet or a Twitter thread about the process to see if there's interest, and then that evolves into a bigger piece of content. Um, but the other thing you can do is sort of look at the instance of this client, this story, this transformation, whatever it is, and try to generalize the learnings on a higher level.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something we do. I spend a lot of time in a non-COVID world as a speaker, and
Mm-hmm.
occasionally we get those questions that someone, they raise their hand and they ask a question, and it's so super specific to their business, and it won't apply to the other, 499 people in
Yeah.
the room.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the idea is to kind of generalize that question and say, it sounds
Mm.
like you're asking this type of question. Here's what most people do in that situation. So kind of opening it up. And you can do
Mm.
the same thing with these customer stories. So here's how this customer, they had this problem and they solved it in this way. There's a good chance you're trying to solve a similar problem, and here are some of the ways you might do that using our tool. So you're
Yeah.
you start with a smaller story and then tell a bigger story around it, and make sure that it's going to be sort of broadly applicable to a bigger segment of your audience.
Yeah. It's such a also like a trick that a lot of journalists all like because they always like with the little experience I have at least with they always try to say okay, make it simpler, make it more understandable. Like how
Yeah.
does it relate, right? Like so I
Yeah.
think that's kind of like a good technique to probably approach it like that and
Yeah.
take a few of those steps. I think the balance is then like it needs to stop somewhere, right? Because oftentimes I am then when I look at an article, for example, that's written, I think, ooh, that's a little bit oversimplified, maybe, or
Yeah.
that's a little bit. So I think that's probably then the difficult part. But yeah, very interesting. So moving on to like news and story, like because it's so often that customers come to us and say, listen, I've got a new collection to share or a new product. Like, how do I turn this into a story? Like, you're often not in that case you're not like looking for what's going on in the company or stories that already exist, but more like no the business is driving that you start communicating about this one. How
Yeah.
would you try and approach such an issue where you're less in the driver's seat into like free to choose something but really need to work with something specific?
So earlier we were chatting about sort of those three things that journalists look for, and there are
Mm-hmm.
others, but those three primary things that we look for, and that was newsworthiness, the human connection, and then some sort of unique angle, like what's
Yes.
special about this.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to think of it like interrogating your story. So this is the story we're trying to tell, our new collection, our new feature, whatever the case may be, and look for those three elements. So why is this important right now? Like, what's happening in society, in our industry, in the world that makes this story important for right now? Hopefully you can find an answer there in some way. Like, consumers are increasingly looking for XYZ. Here's some data. That's why we did this, right? So it's
Yes.
relevant now. The human element would be to see if you can find people who can speak to that first point. So that could be customers, it could be the designer of the collection, it could be some industry expert who can speak to the fact that yes, this is an important thing and people want this, and here's why we need it. And then the last one is that unique element, and that one, again, that's probably the toughest for us to answer because many times we are announcing similar things,
Yes.
monthly, weekly, quarterly. So that can be tough, but I think asking that question can be a really good exercise to say, okay, well, what's different about this collection or this feature or this hire, right? Like, what's special about it? Why is it different than some other option or our competitors or what we did last time? Asking those kinds of questions, even if you can't come up with like one single silver bullet type answer, being able to have a conversation around that to say, this isn't like other hires, or this isn't like anything else on the market, or this is offering something new that we've never offered before. Finding that, like, what's special about it is sometimes something you have to like really think about and kind of dig into it a little bit to find. But if you could put those three things at the forefront, the people, the unique element, and then why it's relevant now, it's gonna go a long way toward getting other folks to care about it.
Yeah, makes sense. And probably when you can't find them about something specific that your boss wants to communicate about, it gives you arguments to push back and say, listen, is this really unique enough for us to, let's just put out a news story or a blog post on our website, but keep it at
Right.
that, right? Because
Yeah.
we don't expect, It does
Yeah.
make me, it reminds me of the fact, like when we were starting the company like 10 years ago, we were kind of bootstrapped, and everyone who was getting an investment was kind of getting in the news and getting on
Yeah.
TechCrunch, and I was like, fuck, we just to get in the press, we should get an investment, not about the money,
Yeah.
but just, so that was like, but I think that changed a little bit as well. If you just, like now, like raising around, for example, as a company, that's not really newsworthy anymore. It depends on how big it is, but
Yeah.
I think that these things change. So yeah, that's
And
interesting.
it's also possible that it may be newsworthy, but not to a broad audience,
Yes.
like the
Yes.
fact that you raised funding, I'll give an example. So the Convoy, we're sort of a B2B marketplace for small businesses.
Yes.
And we did raise a round of funding and we put out a press release, but the goal wasn't to be in the New York Times or
No.
TechCrunch. We're not
Yes.
at that point just yet, hopefully,
No.
right?
Yeah.
But we did get covered in a lot of local press who cared
Yes.
deeply about the fact that local entrepreneurs raised money from local investors, right? So there's an angle there. That's why it's special here in this place. There's also the fact that our founding team is fairly diverse. So like we have an African-American man, we have two Middle Eastern men, and we also have me as a woman who are part of our founding team. And to some publications who closely follow diversity in founders or diversity in the startup space, like that's an interesting story, even though we're not PayPal, we're not
No.
Uber, but we're trying to make a difference. Yeah. There we go. I like that.
You need to think as a founder.
Yeah.
No, and I think you've recently tweeted about Ahrefs as well, that kind of stopped or spent their paid budget for a month on something else.
Yeah.
I think, and I know we had Rand Fishkin on like a few months ago, who was kind of going hard on that as well.
Yeah.
So I think it's sometimes hard for people to say, listen, if I have this ad budget, I get this amount of leads. What would storytelling get me, right? I think that's of course very difficult, but how would you approach such a discussion, which probably are going on at Convoy as well, right? Because you're trying to balance these things out.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's always going to be a question. I think storytelling content is unfortunately never going to be able to escape the what's the ROI conversation.
Yes.
But what's really interesting is if you look at the way we operate just as humans, like purely as people, it's not so transactional. What's the ROI of telling your spouse how your day was? What's the ROI of asking your kid what they did at school? Like it's hard to say, but it's important for relationship building.
Yes.
There may not be a one-to-one conversion rate that you can point to, but it's important for sort of the overall experience. And so I like to remind the brands I'm working with or leaders that think of this sort of like dating. Like if you really just want to get numbers, like you can walk into a bar and just propose to everyone you see. And you can do that by all means. But if you want to build a quality relationship, you're going to have to ask questions and tell
Mm,
stories and
mm,
listen and
mm.
create a back and forth that develops any sort of meaningful connection. And so I like to say that we're sort of the dating part of the equation, right? We're getting to know people, we're letting them get to know us, we're building those bonds so that hopefully when it comes time to ask for a date or something, like it's our chances of getting a yes are much better because we've laid that groundwork.
Cool. I think everyone can use that as a pitch for every storytelling campaign from now on. I
There
love
you
that.
go.
Thank you very much. All right, we've got a question that came in from Stephanie from Sennheiser, the audio products, and
Mhm.
she's a customer of Presley. And she said, like, as you probably know, our pro audio products are often quite techy. So I'm hoping for a few additional ideas on how to create more storytelling around them. So how would you use storytelling to communicate something that's quite technical to a lay audience? What
Mm,
form could do stories take? So this is quite a broad question, but something
yeah.
that comes up quite a lot. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, and this a lot of industries face this. Anything that's
Yes.
technical, highly regulated, or again, especially if your buyer is not the person who's going to be using the product, they may not have the background
Mm.
knowledge to understand your positioning, your benefits. So there's a couple approaches. One is to take that approach we talked about before of sort of generalizing. So while an individual consumer may not have preferences for how many decibels of noise cancellation or something like that, they may understand the value of being able to have this call without hearing your dog barking outside, or
Yeah.
sort of generalize it into a more tangible experience. They can kind of understand, like, here's why this feature is important, that I can connect with, that I can relate
Mm.
to. um,
Mhm.
the other approach you could take is an educational approach to say, you may not think about, I don't know how many decibels of noise cancellation your headphones have. However, here's why that matters. Here's the science behind, what range you should choose. Here's what the
Mm.
difference is between this level and this level. And there's a lot of really fun interactive ways you can create educational content. So I don't know this, unfortunately, I picked this decibels of noise cancellation. I don't even know if that's a thing, but we're going to roll with it.
Yeah.
Um, you can imagine an audio experience that shows you, like, here's what it sounds like to have a dog barking outside your window. Here's what that sounds with this many
Mm.
decibels of noise cancellation. Here's this. You can kind of show, like, let them hear it. Let them hear the progression of what that difference makes.
Mm.
Take them inside of the technology, have Parallax Scroll sort of take your piece apart and show what the different pieces are and why they're important. Could do an infographic that walks through step by step what each of the pieces, how they contribute to that overall experience. I think there's a lot of room to educate our audience, because if
Yeah.
on some level, if they don't have the knowledge they need to make an informed choice about our products, then we can give them that information so that they can feel more confident making that choice.
Yeah, I think like in your example, which you quite rightfully kind of bring up, like quite visual and audio
Yeah.
visual examples, like infographic, audio clips, like maybe movies. Is this something that we as storytellers need to be more conscious of to use them? Because in a lot of cases, it's so easy to just have a plain Word document and drop it in kind of the
Yeah.
journalist mailboxes. But you say that this is no longer working?
I don't think that it's no longer working, but I think even for us as consumers, I mean,
Mm.
you and I could have had this conversation and published a bazillion word blog post, and I don't
Yeah,
know that everyone who's here listening would have read that, right?
no,
Doesn't mean that some people wouldn't, doesn't mean that there's not search value to having all those words on your website.
absolutely.
But, understanding that different people prefer to engage with information in different ways. I mean, even something like a book, you have the physical form, you have an ebook, you have an audiobook, right? So
Mm.
understanding that when you can make your content multi-format, when you can expand beyond the typical format, you're going to open yourself up to deeper engagement with new people. um, we've sort of debunked that sort of like different types of learners, that some people are audio learners, but that doesn't mean we don't have preferences.
Yeah.
I love audiobooks. Like, I've got a whole bookshelf over here. Can't tell you how many of these I've actually touched, but I do own the audiobook for most of them, and I
Yeah.
have listened to them.
Yeah.
That's just like what's easiest for me. So,
Mm.
being able to offer those different formats opens you up to different audiences. But some things you just can't describe in text alone. Talking
Mhm.
about levels of noise cancellation. I mean, I need to hear it to understand
Yeah.
what that means, you know?
Yeah.
Or same thing, like we often see, you know, so visual tech companies like cameras or, you know, phones that have cameras in them, they'll often show side by side, like, this is what our camera looks like when you take photos at night, and
Yeah.
this is what the competition looks like. And you could describe that. You could say megapixels and, you know, I mean, and go into ISO and shutter speed, but like showing it side by side visually is the best way to understand that difference. So I think if we default to the same format all the time, we're missing opportunities to tell our stories in more compelling ways.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Like, I think everyone understands what the value is of storytellers and what the value is of storytelling in kind of communication, marketing, being seen as interesting, and so on. But how do you make that process of becoming a better storyteller kind of more explicit? I, for example, I see the value of great CEOs being very open and doing
Yeah.
really awesome Twitter threads. And I'm jealous when I see Rand Fishkin write an article. I said, like, damn, I should have written that. And of course, like, but how do you think that? How can you learn? How can you become better at that? Is it just a matter of doing it? Do you kind of like have good tips on people need to read more? What's your
Yeah.
technique there?
So there's lots of great resources out there, and
Yeah.
we can run through some of them in a moment. But I think that the biggest thing is like none of that happens by accident. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of us, you know, this is like true of our New Year's resolutions and everything
Yeah.
else. Like the best of intentions and wanting to do it is probably not going to get you there. The best thing I can recommend is like put time on your calendar. And that
Yeah.
might be 15 minutes a week. That may be all you can muster. That's totally fine. Use that 15 minutes to read great content, to watch great content, to read a book, to take a course on Skillshare or watch some YouTube videos, like whatever it is, to draft your next Twitter thread.
Mm.
I saw Kanar Bell is here watching, I think on LinkedIn, and he's a former colleague of mine from Foundation. And one of the things we would do is put time on the calendar. Like I'm going to work on a Twitter thread for this 30-minute spread
Yeah.
or this 15-minute spread. You know, someone like Rand, like you mentioned, I mean, that thread didn't happen while he was waiting in line for coffee. Like that was
No.
prep, that was planned, right? So I
Mm.
think that's the biggest step. Like regardless of what resources you choose, make that commitment, whether it's daily, weekly, whatever. I'm going to work on becoming a better storyteller. Just like I want to get in shape, I'm going to go to the gym, right?
Yeah.
So that's like step one. I mentioned some resources there. I like to read Content Marketing Institute has a fantastic blog, lots of free resources. That's covering things from more of a marketing perspective, but you will find a lot of tips for using different formats for storytelling, you know, mixed in there.
Mhm.
Let's see, there's got so many great books. I'll have to point you all to a thread. I did a meta thread of like my favorite marketing books
Yeah.
somewhere,
But
but
we'll look it up and add it in the show notes afterwards
they will
and as
find
a writer.
it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
We'll
Um,
definitely link it up.
but yeah, there's, I mean, like Kendra Hall wrote a book that, let's see, is it right there? Stories That Stick is one. That's Kendra Hall's book. Everybody Writes by Anne Hanley is another great one that kind of walks you through writing specifically.
Mhm.
Um, What Sticks, I think, Chip
Yeah.
and Heath. Oh, I forget the. I think it's Chip and Heath something. I don't know where they are. Let's see. I'll have to look at the list, but
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
so many great books out there. The one thing I would encourage you to do is I think storytelling. If you're searching for Made to Stick, that's it. Thank you, Kate. Made to Stick. Um, uh, that's the book. But there are so many um, great books out there. What I would encourage you to do though is look for words other than storytelling,
Yeah.
not because storytelling isn't a great thing to look for, but because what you'll find there is often like high level stuff. It's
Yeah.
about like what people like to say. You know, it's like really high level stuff. And if you're looking to improve your skills, you're probably going to want something more tactical. Um, you know, humbly, my own book, the Content Fuel Framework, is a super tactical approach to coming up
Mm.
with content ideas. But there are a lot of really tactical books that will walk you through different skill sets to make you feel more confident as a storyteller.
Okay, cool, cool. I think, well, like once you have your story great and you're happy with it, I believe there's so much stories that are really good, but just nobody actually finds them or they're not
Yeah.
discoverable. So I think this is also kind of interesting to go into a little bit deeper is that like the part of pitching, right? So you've been previously a journalist, so you've kind of been
Yeah.
on the other side of it. But how when you feel you have a story that's authentic, that's kind of on brand, that you how do you go about the distribution part? Of course, media relations, but maybe also on the other parts.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I think is really important to remember is, you know, we've touched on this a few times. We think that everything we do is amazing, or we think it's
Yes.
boring, and we have to think it's amazing. But it's really important to note that the journalists that you're reaching out to, the folks that you're wanting to cover this, are getting absolutely inundated with with irrelevant content. I mean, like I very clearly am focused in marketing. I can't tell you how many pitches I've gotten about, like, you know, supply chain in countries I've never been to, or like drone technology. People don't do their research. Now, you
No.
may do your research, but you have to understand that the audience that's getting your press releases is very skeptical and very quick to delete, not because of you, but because of the absolute, like, deluge of irrelevant stuff we're getting pitched all the time.
Yeah.
So the bar is high is essentially what, what to keep in mind. So I would much prefer that you reach out personally to like 15 or 20 journalists than reach out to 200 with any sort of general, neutral mass thing. It's
Yes.
just not going to work. There's too much out there. So that's sort of like step one. I know it's basic, but just understanding that you have a skeptical audience that you're reaching, and so the bar is high. The next thing is that as easy as you can make it for them to say yes, that's what you want to focus on. Because if I've got, say I have 3 pitches in my inbox that are all relevant and I might write about them, and one includes an infographic and some imagery that I have the rights to use, and contact information for 3 sources that are willing to talk to me, that is a much easier yes than the other one where I have to start from scratch. I've got to find my own images. I've got to track down sources myself and get their emails. So the easier you can make it, the more you can provide. At least provide access to it. You don't have to send all this stuff at once. That might be a lot, but letting them know, hey, we've got, a folder worth of images that are, rights managed. You can take them and use them. We've got, 6 sources that are willing to chat with you. Just make it easy for them to say yes. Make it so easy that they can't say no.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I think what we see in our data as well is that whenever people start sending out smaller pitches, like to groups of 20, and at once, right, personalized more, like engagement on those emails is a lot higher on those pitches. So
Exactly.
I think
Yeah,
it
you
makes
can.
it. Yeah.
You can still reach out to multiple people. It's more about making sure that you're choosing the right people and you're doing it with intention.
Yes.
If there are several writers for similar publications or at the same publication, you can reach out to all of them for sure.
Yeah.
What I don't want you to do is like BCC 5,000 reporters and say like, you're going to love this story. Like, they're definitely not going to love this story.
No, absolutely not. And it takes a little bit more time to personalize and make it specific and make sure that's relevant for them. So you need to realize that as well. But success is potentially higher. I think that's kind of right.
And coming back to our dating analogy is like, I mean, do you want to do Tinder where you're just like swiping right on everyone and hoping that your chances are good? Or do you want to, like, I don't know, match.com, like, fill out a survey, talk to some people, make sure you're matching with people that you're compatible with,
Yeah. There's probably audiences for both, right?
This is true.
All right. There are questions already coming in. So if you have questions, we're going to go through some Q&A later on. But one question I already want to kind of catch up, which is from Venture Well. And that's an interesting one. So I'm going to just bring it up. What's your biggest storytelling mistake and what did you learn?
That's a good one. I like that. This might not be a popular answer, but I'm just going to go with it. I had an instance with a client who I won't name, but the client was very insistent on wanting to do something that I knew was not a good strategic choice. And I sort of gave in too soon. I wish that I had pushed harder to say, like, no, really, this is not going to work out well for us. This is, not going to get the results you want. And I think that's the biggest sort of mistakes or regrets that I have are mostly in that vein of like, this had the chance to be a fantastic story. Like, this was a diamond in the rough, right? And I gave up just before we got to polish it, right? Or I didn't fight hard enough, which I know maybe I'm taking on too much blame. You can't change the world as one storyteller, but I do think that sometimes it's easier to tell the story that's not as compelling. It's easier to tell the story that is not aligned with your strategy, or like we were saying before, the press release your boss wants to send, even though we know it's not newsworthy. And sometimes if you can just like muster up the effort to push a little bit harder, you can get to a place that's going to achieve your goals and also make it easier for you to sleep at night.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. And another question come in, and we're going to just pick it up as they come, which is a good one. How do you balance the need for optimizing content and good storytelling? I think it's also a little bit about sometimes marketing says from an SEO perspective, we need to have this, and this, right? Which is sometimes difficult to meet or match with good storytelling. How do
Yeah.
you balance that?
I wish that there was a really easy answer or like a
Yeah,
checklist I could give you. It is definitely a tough balance.
yeah,
The one thing that I try to always do is when we are combining those interests is to really ask, does this belong here?
yeah,
And if it doesn't, then maybe we need to create that piece of content that is not intended to be a good story. It's intended to capture the search key
yes,
terms, right?
yeah,
There's ways for you to kind of touch on both things, but to expect any single piece of content to kind of accomplish all of our goals as an organization is probably having expectations a bit too high. So yeah, when I've created a fantastic story that's going to work well for engagement or awareness, and they're wanting conversions put in there, I think it's okay to say this doesn't actually belong in here. This is not going to get those results that you want, but let's also do this more conversion focused piece that walks through the 6 reasons to buy our
yes,
product, right?
yes.
You can do both, but you sometimes
Mm,
can't do them all at once.
mm,
Um, the other thing is to work with those folks who are maybe pushing for whichever priority is not yours at the moment.
yeah,
To meet with them earlier in the process and try to work together to come up with something that will hopefully hit on more of those goals. Um,
mm,
I find that, if you're having a content brainstorm and then you're teaming up with, say, SEO or your PR team afterward, it's sometimes hard to
yeah,
retrofit. But if you can work together sooner, you might be able to come up with a slightly different version of that piece of content that does get closer to that goal.
yeah.
So hopefully just collaborating sooner.
Yeah. That makes sense because most of the time the briefing is look at the top 10 articles on this keyword on
Yeah.
Google and make a similar version of this. But no writer or storyteller is ever excited by such a challenge, I
Right.
guess.
Right.
So I think
So
that's kind of where you need to find the
yeah.
balance, huh?
So if you could start it with, here are some of the keywords that are important to us, help us find a story around these keywords where we can say something compelling in this space. Like that kind of
Mm,
approach, maybe it's not going to be the same title with a different number on it, but it's going to be in that same vein and allow us to use those keywords in a piece of content that's also actually worth clicking on.
yeah. And I think like we've touched upon this, and but I'd like to come back to this a little bit. Like, especially when you're, for example, at an agency, you're working for multiple clients, right? How do you spot storytelling opportunities, right? How can
Mm.
you be on top of these things, and whenever you see an opportunity, you kind of jump on top of it because
Yeah.
some brands are really good at it, like Burger King or something. That are really fast when something
Yeah.
happens, and it only makes sense to do it in that specific moment, and then they kind of go about and so on. But how do you set up a structure that you can kind of consistently do that for maybe multiple clients?
So that kind of responsiveness, I don't know if this is what you're hoping for, but I'm just going to be real and say I don't think most of us can do that, can be that
No.
responsive in real time. And then there's a
Hmm.
couple of reasons. One of them is just the level of resources it takes to be
Sure.
able to drop everything or have someone on call to just fully dedicate to something totally out of the blue. That's a challenge for most brands,
Mm.
especially like small and mid-sized brands. If you don't have enterprise support, that's tough.
No. Yeah.
The other thing is that a lot of us have more regulation or approval systems around us. I've worked with a lot of heavily regulated companies, in the medical space, pharma, finance, natural gas. Like you can't just do that without running by legal like 6 or 7
Mm.
times. So it's not going to be the right fit, the right type of storytelling, real time responsive storytelling for every brand. But if you are hoping to do that, and it is something that's within, your capabilities, you want to have really clear guidelines up front about your brand, your voice, your tone, what you do and don't do, where you draw various lines, so that you can understand how you can act freely within those bounds. I think when that stuff backfires, it's typically because there aren't clearly defined boundaries. And I thought I could swear, but I can't. Or I thought I could mention our CEO, but I can't. I thought I could recommend something and I can't. So those kinds of guardrails of like, what are we allowed? Where are the boundaries? Where am I allowed to roam free within those boundaries? That's going to be what empowers you most to be able to act quickly, because you already know where your safe zone is.
Okay, cool. Makes sense. Okay, some more questions came in, one through email here. How does storytelling differ between B2C and B2B audiences? So many B2Bs feel interchangeable. I think there's some value in, like, truth in that at the very least.
It's true. It's true. I think the biggest reason that so many B2Bs feel interchangeable is because I think we are overestimating the difference between B2B and
Yeah.
B2C. And I know it's like really trite to say, like, we're all humans, you're marketing people to people, but like, really, we are, at the end of the day, whether your buyer is buying something for their home or for their team, like they're probably considering a lot of the same factors. They probably engage with the same style of content. They probably, have the same attention span, regardless of who they're shopping for. So I think if we try to dehumanize our content because we think we're selling to a business entity, it's going to make it so that there's none of that sparkle and flair that makes, a brand special, because we have pulled all the personality, all the, the individual stories. The human element is just gone. And so I think if we could bring some of that back in, when you think of the B2B brands that stand out, it's usually because they're bucking that trend. They're not just talking about features and benefits and leaving personality at the door. So I would encourage folks not to stress quite so much about B2B and B2C, and really just think about your buyer. Who is that buyer, and what are they concerned about? And again, whether they're buying for their home, for themselves, for their team, thinking about what is it that they are most concerned about in this purchase cycle.
Yeah. So your advice to B2B is that they don't need to identify as B2B, because that's probably what's causing some of their issues, right?
I think this is again, Ross Simmons from Foundation Inc. says this all the time. Like, there's no such thing as boring marketing. There's just boring marketers. Like, you don't have to be boring. You don't have to think that B2B is this limit that like,
Yes.
I must be in this little box. I can only create white papers and I can only be on LinkedIn. Like, if you do that to yourself, you're putting limits on your own marketing, on your own potential and your growth. So
Yeah.
by all means, be B2B. Like, it's helpful to have that categorization and finding resources and products that are a fit for you, and finding your audience. But don't let it limit you. Don't think that because I'm B2B, I'm not allowed to be fun or funny or innovative or try new things or go on TikTok. Like, don't let it become a limit for you.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I've wrote that down for us. That's even for us very important, I feel.
Yeah.
All right, like one more question from VentureWell came in. Did you have a surprise hit story? I'm curious about that as well. Why were your expectations low, and how did the story's response exceed those expectations? What did you learn from that experience? Something comes to mind?
I mean, my number one example for this, and I've talked about it many times before, so hopefully it's new for some folks here. Back in 2014, we did a piece for Netflix. Their show Orange is the New Black, about women in prison, was coming out with a new season, and they wanted us to do something at the New York Times. And I don't think that my expectations were low. I think that I knew I was taking a risk. That might be a better way to describe it. What we try to do is convince them that we should tell a really editorial story, like really approach it like journalists. And instead of talking about characters and plots and the set and the director, like, let's really talk to women in actual prisons and see what their experience is like, and kind of draw connections between the themes of the show. So it's not that I thought it would do poorly. It was more like, I don't know how this is going to go. This could go well. It could go poorly. We don't really know. My instinct said that it would go well, because we're going to try to do what journalists do. And we were really lucky that the story we told, my team was made up of all former journalists. So we were like all in on telling this story as journalistically as we could. And the piece did gangbusters. I mean, it was one of the top viewed pieces on the New York Times that year, in like the top 2% of content. We won a number of industry awards. We were covered in the press really widely, and all because people were surprised that a brand could sponsor a story that was really a story and not just about the brand. I think that's really what made it work, is people were like, wow, this is actually interesting and valuable and
Mm.
sharing new insights and not just telling me to go watch the show. Unfortunately, I think that novelty is no longer a differentiator. Like, simply creating good content is no longer enough. At the time, multimedia storytelling was not quite as common as it is now. And we also had a lot of scrutiny on us at doing sponsored content at the New York Times. There was a lot of skepticism. So
Yeah.
that was sort of a perfect storm of timing and trying something new. But I think for me, that was a good reminder to sometimes, like I said, you have to push those boundaries. You have to try something new. You have to take a risk and push further than you might otherwise.
Yeah, and interesting, I think, for a lot of listeners now and viewers, is also like, how do you get buy-in to do these types of things? Because there's kind of a story where in software nobody gets fired for hiring IBM, right? Like,
Yeah.
because it's so if you don't take a risk, it's never gonna. But even if you take a risk or you take a chance on something, it's often that there's more risk towards it. So how do you kind of like fight for that?
And I think in this case, honestly, it was like I said, a combination of, I had a really good relationship with the brand and the agency. I had worked with them
Yes.
on content
Mm.
prior. So there was a good sense of trust there, that when I said, I know this is different, but I really think that this could help us stand out. I think that this is going to be something that works for us. Will you take this risk with me? I was really transparent about it. And we had built that relationship enough that they were willing to take that risk with me, which was really great. The other thing is, being totally honest, a brand like Netflix, they understood the value of
Yes.
storytelling. I
Yes.
didn't have to tell them, like,
No,
you
no,
guys
of
aren't going
course
to
not.
believe this, but people love stories. So if you can help it, having a high profile, big budget brand that loves storytelling would certainly help.
Yeah.
Um, but no, I think a lot of it is just conviction, right? And understanding. I knew our audience, and I understood and had a good relationship with the brand. So my ability to find the overlap between what both would be interested in,
Hmm.
um, I was in a much better position to make a risky recommendation, because I had a strong understanding of the audience and the brand. And so the best way to set yourself up for a similar opportunity is similarly to, like, really understand your audience deeply, really understand your brand and what the values are, and you'll be much better able to identify opportunities like that when the chance arises. When there's a new platform or a new way of telling stories, you'll be better able to capitalize on that, because you can see those overlaps.
Yeah, yeah. People are already looking at the story, and it looks awesome. That's what they're sharing. But all
Um,
right, we're nearing the end. It's been amazing. I've made so many notes, so thanks so much already, Melanie.
yeah,
Where can people find you online if they want to learn more and kind of follow you along your
yeah.
storytelling journey?
So I'm most active on Twitter. So you can find me
Hmm.
on Twitter as M Deziel, first
Hmm.
initial last name. So you'll find me there. That's where I hang out most often. But I'm on all the other platforms if you prefer. So you can find me on Instagram and find me on LinkedIn. My website is storyfuel.co. So storyfuel.co. That's my main website, and you can find all the social links there too. And if you're curious about what we're up to at the Convoy, if you're a small or mid-sized business or a solopreneur and you're hoping to get some discounts on the products and services you use every day, you can learn more about us at theconvoy.com.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll add those links in the roundup that people get in their mailbox. So go to
Perfect.
prezi.com/live and subscribe if you want to have that a roundup as well. One more thing. Normally we send gifts to our guests, and we've sent like Belgian beer and chocolate all over the world. You told us no, do something different. So tell us a little bit about the good cause that you want us to sponsor.
So there's I can't even remember which cause I gave to you exactly. Did I
Coral
give you a
reef,
specific one?
something? Yeah, coral. Something about coral reef. Is that
Oh
correct?
yes, the coral reefs. Okay, so I have a
Yes.
couple that I cycle through.
Yes.
Yeah, since I don't drink, I try to put my gifts and love toward causes that are special to me. I'm a really big fan of the environment and doing our part. Unfortunately, a lot of the living we do and the the work we do is just not environmentally friendly. So our coral reefs, guys, our coral reefs are like really suffering. They really need our help. And it's not the kind of thing that is just like decorative, like, oh, corals are pretty, so we should save them. They're a vital part of our ocean ecosystem, and that feeds into everything we do on land. So supporting the restoration and the protection of the coral reefs is like something we should care more about, even though it's far away, it's underwater. Like, promise you, it's impacting your daily life, the food you eat, the air you breathe. We need that coral.
Yep. So that's what's coming. Not your way, but in your name, we'll make a donation to thank you for this
Thank
awesome
you.
episode. So no, it's been good. I think a lot of people had a lot of notes and a lot of interesting bits that they can use in their daily lives. So thank you so much for joining us, and take care. The rest of you, thanks so much for joining, and we see you next time. Bye bye. Bye guys.